is Friday, January 17th. And we are continuing our work on the governor's budget adjustment. We're going to spend the next 30 minutes or so talking about the child care contribution tax. As folks know, this was originally sort of going to be thought of as a new tax type. It's now been integrated somewhat into income tax withholdings. And given that this was the first year of collections and spending on it, wanted to make sure that we are tracking it closely, essentially to ensure that we set up the taxes properly. And so wanted to spend a minute talking about the reversions with the Child Development Division. So Commissioner McLaughlin, thank you for joining us.
Yep, happy to be here.
And the floor is yours if you want to share your thoughts on budget adjustment with us.
Sure. Thanks, Representative Kornheiser. So for everyone, I'm Janet McLaughlin. I'm the Deputy Commissioner in the Department for Children and Families, overseeing the Child Development Division. That is the part of DCF that does sort of all things childcare, as well as Children's Integrated Services, which is our program that supports young children with developmental needs or at risk of developmental delay or disability. And Megan Smeaton, who is our financial director for the Department for Children and Families, is with us as well. So, and I think you wanted a little bit of a background. Did you want a little bit of a background on the Child Development Division and the work first, or do you want to just dive right into the?
Yeah, just just a moment or two. We're not going to spend, it's not necessarily our committee purview, and it's always helpful to have context about the work we're doing. So thank you. That would be great if you don't mind a little context on your division and then focusing on CCFAP and how that all works.
Okay. And I apologize. I didn't double check before. Did some documents arrive to you guys that have some summary information on the? No. Okay.
They unfortunately have not arrived.
Okay.
Would you like to share your screen with us though, and then send it after the fact?
Yep.
Sorcia's going to give you permission right now.
Okay.
Is that working?
I think so. Is it working for you guys?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so I have two very high level documents that you guys can look at in more detail as you'd like. But in general, right, the Child Development Division is working with community partners to provide Vermonters with affordable access to high quality childcare and child development services. We do that with a state team of between sort of 60 and 70 employees within the Child Development Division. And so we're one of the smaller teams within DCF, but that is because we do so much of our work through community partners. Those include through community partners, which you'll see on the next slide. As in terms of how families engage with the Child Development Division, there sort of are a few key functions which are here under the how we can help. The one is sort of finding childcare, and this has to do with both sort of our childcare licensing function, right? We regulate childcare within the state to ensure they're meeting foundational health and safety standards, go out and do, unannounced annual compliance visits, investigate concerns and complaints, and make sure, again, that the programs are supporting the healthy development and learning of young children. And this is for center-based childcare programs, for family childcare programs, as well as for after-school programs. So we're licensing programs for children up to the age of about 13. And then we have some support for referral and helping families get connected with childcare. But I think everybody is familiar that one of the barriers often is availability and capacity. In terms of paying for childcare, we manage the Childcare Financial Assistance Program, right? That is the program that saw the most changes associated with it, including the amount of funding allocated to it from Act 76. So that's really the Childcare Financial Assistance is the core of the probably the core of the conversation. And then we also do support children and families through our Children's Integrated Services Program, and that again supports them to access early intervention, specialized childcare, home visiting, and sort of other prevention services. So it really is focused on the needs of some of our youngest and most vulnerable Vermonters. The other thing I just wanted to point out, and I'm just going to put to my other tab here, is this is really some of the our key partners are listed on this tab, as well as some of the ways that we engage directly with childcare programs, with directors and owners and leaders of these programs. We recognize they are the backbone of doing the work directly for families. So again, I had mentioned childcare licensing. In terms of finances, there is both the Childcare Financial Assistance Program, which provides supports to families and to programs based on how it's designed. We provide business technical assistance. We do offer some grant opportunities for programs. We do a lot of work to support the early childhood education and after-school workforce in terms of training, career development, college-level scholarships, student loan repayment. We support quality improvement through our STARS program, which provides external assessments and then provides coaches that supports programs through quality improvement programs. And then have a variety of other sort of health and safety and program supports that are available. And we do a lot of that work in partners that are listed to the right, including Head Start, Building Bright Futures, First Children's Finance. The Northern Lights at the Community College of Vermont is one of our big partners, Vermont After School for those school-age care, and then the Vermont Association for the Education of Young Children, really around supporting the early childhood education workforce. So those are just a very high level overview of some of the work of the Child Development Division. Any questions on that?
No, thank you.
Okay. So in terms of the Budget Adjustment Act, I will, for that affected Child Development Division, I will turn that over to Megan Smeaton to share what is in it.
Thank you. Hey everyone, for the record, Megan Smeaton, Financial Director, DCF, as Janet said. So yes, we have adjusted our funding breakout essentially for the Child Care Financial Assistance Program, or CCFAP, this year as part of the BAA. In July, the Vermont E-Board adopted economist projections that the Child Care Payroll Tax Special Fund would be collecting more revenue than we had in our base appropriation. So our base appropriation for the Child Care Special Fund was set at about $79.6 million. The economists projected that the revenue coming in would be $92.8 million. And so we are proposing a $13.2 million swap, essentially, of special fund for general fund within our CCFAP budget. And this just really allows the special fund can only be used for specific purposes in Act 76 for the Child Care Development Division. And so by doing this, we allow AHS to have more flexibility with the general fund, and it doesn't impact the availability of funding for our CCFAP program. In addition to that, we had $8 million that was part of the waterfall, like in the budget last year, that has gone into our special fund on top of that. So there's another $8 million in there to cover needs should they arise beyond the $92.8 million that this is adjusting it to, which aligns with the economists and the E-Board adopted revenue.
Thank you. Questions from folks? Yeah, Representative Holcomb.
Maybe I'm a little slow here. Thank you for coming in. So I think what you're saying is take payroll taxes and use that to offset functions that are supported by the income tax in the general fund?
Yeah, so we have our Child Care Financial Assistance Program is funded through many different sources. We have federal funds in there, we have special funds, we have various federal funding sources. So basically, we charge expenses as they come in based on the eligibility of the child and the child care placement. We obviously leverage federal funds first. And when we have costs that are not eligible for any federal funding, those fall, and they can either be paid using the special fund, the child care special fund, or the general fund. They're fungible essentially. And so in this instance, if we have more special fund available to us, it means we will use less general fund.
And just to be clear, what is it you're proposing when you free up general fund? What is it you're proposing to spend it on?
It's part of AHS's entire budget submission. So it was used as part of the AHS submission. So we're not specifically proposing to spend it on any one thing.
And can you clarify if overall you are spending less on childcare assistance than you planned, or if this is just a revised revenue estimate that is causing this?
It's both things. So on our ups downs for BAA, you'll see two lines. They're both 13 million, which is slightly confusing, but they are.
And that's just a coincidence?
It's just a coincidence, yeah.
Okay.
So it just happens that way, and I can see how it could be very confusing. So the first one on there is our caseload projection. So basically we're saying that we did a really detailed analysis of our caseload trends. We included populations that have been added this year for income brackets and the number of certificates in each population, as well as the actual census of each population of income brackets. And then we projected that out. We were very aggressive in our growth of the uptake of the higher income brackets that just came in October, because we wanted to ensure that we are, whatever we say we're not going to spend, we're really confident in. So we were very, projecting a really high, a large number of incoming people in those income brackets that haven't yet signed up. We think a lot of the savings that we're seeing so far is just the time it takes for families in the new income brackets to learn about the program and sign up for the program and see the benefits of the program. And that this is a one-time cut because it's BAA. It's too soon to extrapolate, those projections onto anything else, but we are confident that we have at least $13 million of savings that just won't be spent this year. As a result of just those caseload trends that we're seeing. On top of that, we also have this $13 million swap, which is just a revenue realignment. So there's really two moving pieces there. There's the caseload underspend, and then there's the realignment of how we're spending our funding on the back end.
And what I hear you saying is that you don't have any questions yet on if the revenues and your projected spending are actually misaligned. It's just in terms of the structure of the fund, it's just in this first year you think you're underspending because it's taking a little bit to do for a full expansion. Okay. Representative Madsen?
Yeah, thank you. My questions are similar to Rep. Holcomb's in the chair. Maybe sound a little differently, but I'm concerned with where you started by saying that the money in is different from what the economists predicted. And you seem to have done a fairly, maybe clever is the wrong word, but a way to balance the books for the time being. But I'm concerned about going forward, whether we goofed collectively and we need to do some overhaul. And we'll find that out as we work through, I think, but that's my concern.
Well, one of my questions is, I imagine you're basing this on the revenue forecast from July. And I know collections have, on a month-by-month basis, been coming in soft, and we have a new update, which might not be an upgrade, it might be a downgrade, happening next week. And so it seems like we'll still have some moving parts that we'll need to figure out next week.
I mean, yes, there will be a new projection next week. We obviously had to build our budget based off
of course
we had available at the time. So
okay, so it seems like we might as a committee just need to keep this topic open pending the new forecast and the new numbers coming in, but, yeah.
Yeah, I would be concerned about using money that is raised specifically for childcare for any other purpose. And it turns out that it's too much. We could always lower the tax rate, or we could save it in case there's an uptake in the service and the people applying. And to the second point, as I was knocking on doors, I heard from a childcare provider that parents are a little loath to this committee because to share their personal financial information with childcare provider. And the question is, I wonder if there's a way through the Department of Taxes for them to look at the AGI or whatever they're exactly looking at, and then to be able to provide the help to pay for childcare without the childcare provider having to figure out, exceed personal information.
Are people doing their eligibility through their provider or through you all?
Yeah. No, so we have community childcare support agencies who have eligibility specialists, and that is and those are, you know, nonprofits around the state who do the eligibility work. So they are not sharing their income directly with the person that they're working with day to day, but they do have to, you know, based on the current design, they do have to share it with someone. In terms of looking at the income, it's pretty detailed. Because we're looking at gross income, and historically, many of the families that have benefited from a program like Child Care Financial Assistance have had income that might fluctuate, or they don't, you know what I mean? It's not sort of like their taxes one year aren't necessarily the best indicator of their current income. Especially when we were at families that were in the lower income bands. Maybe that is changing, and that is a conversation, that we could consider having. I think the other point I just want to make, because I think this has come up for some folks as we think about this, is I do want folks to know that we have seen a dramatic uptake in Child Care Financial Assistance. We rolled out all the changes on time in terms of eligibility. We rolled out all the changes on time in terms of increasing rates. We do have, based on the numbers my team gave me, they were still double checking everything, but 40% more families benefiting from Child Care Financial Assistance now. We're paying out more than—
That's amazing. That's wonderful.
So that's happened. So like, I just want to say there's not on our side, there's been no part of the underspend that I think could be considered some sort of a slow walk on the part of DCF or CDD.
So 40% more folks are benefiting from this. And then do you also, are more slots opening up for childcare as a result of the work that we've been doing?
Yes. So I think the numbers that we have between June 2023 and December 2024 are showing just about a net increase of about 500 spots right now.
That's huge.
As the net increase, more in terms of infants and toddlers in the last 6 months, though, for the first time in like 10 years, we saw more programs opening than closing. So it really feels like when you look at the graphs, on our website, you can see that, what had been sort of a steady decline over many, many years is flattening out, and hopefully we're turning the curve.
Can you please make sure you send those charts over as well when you
Yeah.
send your testimony, so we can all have them? Thank you. I have one more question. I'm going to go to other folks. Have you all discussed the idea of having a reserve in the special fund so that we could protect ourselves from fluctuations?
So I'm not certain we've discussed that specifically, but I would go back to the $8 million that we have from the waterfall. That is not part of our estimate of the 13 million that we're requesting the swap for. So I think that very essentially acts as that reserve for this year. It's been added to the special fund as part of the budget waterfall last year. It was not part of the economist projections when they projected the 92 million. And so I think, even if there are changes in the report that comes out next week, we do have that 8 million still available to us.
Thank you.
But that 8 million isn't necessarily protected. It's available, right? As a reserve, I'm just trying to think of a set aside to make sure it doesn't get sucked back out, as you know what I mean. But I guess my question too, on the uptake and the 40% uptake that you've had, and is it geographically concentrated or is it across the state? It'd be very interesting to know across the state as to where those spots have become available with the 500 additional spots from June of 2023 to December 2024.
Yep, I don't have that analysis in front of me here, but we can work on that. But my, in terms of some of the programs that we had programs open up in, I think, 11 counties, and I think we're not seeing we're not seeing a concentration in one area of the state or another, just sort of obviously as we look at things. So I think it is spread out.
Was there a hand over here that I lost?
I was just.
Okay. Representative Holcomb.
I'm sorry, just on that 40%, can you clarify, is that 40% additional families receiving subsidy, or is that 40% additional families accessing childcare?
That is 40% additional families receiving subsidy. So in June of 2023, our number was 7,048, and in December of 24, the number was 9,851.
Pretty cool.
Hmm.
I'm gonna feel the glow for a minute. Thanks, Bennett. Anyone else? Anything else you want to share with us? Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks for having us.
Okay, next we are going to hear from Chris Roop, who Chris has prepared sort of a draft of a memo about the budget adjustment. Not every committee is doing this. I think it's a helpful way for us to sort of get clear with each other transparently on where we are on each piece. Some of these are sort of greater interest than others. This is all very draft, especially and Chris will say that more. I'm not trying to railroad anything through the committee. It's helpful to start with language and go from there.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Chris Roop, Joint Fiscal. For those who are new to the committee, this process should very much resemble something that the committee did last year, where the House Committee on Appropriations will ask policy committees to submit their thoughts and feedback on the BAA by a certain date. Chair Robin Shai has requested feedback by next Thursday from committees. And your chair has asked me just to take an initial stab at putting some words on paper that take a look at the provisions in the BAA that are of interest to this committee's jurisdiction and start sketching out some possible items to include in your response. I want to be very, very clear that I am not putting words in the committee's mouth by any means, and we should wordsmith this collectively to reflect your vision. But this is not my vision.
And we're also not wordsmithing collectively ever in the next
enough.
5 months.
Fair enough. And
if people have policy concerns with the words on the page, we will
yes.
tackle that.
And the chart here corresponds to the different sections that are in the governor's BAA language. So not everything in there is super relevant to the committee's jurisdiction. I'm just trying to focus on those that are. So the first item is the one that you just heard about, the reduction in general funds and swapping some costs on a revenue neutral basis over to the child care contribution special fund. I spoke to this with some of my colleagues who staff the budget operation in JFO, and this is certainly of interest to other committees. I think the language that is here, sort of suggests that perhaps pending the, availability of more information next year, or next week rather, with the revised revenue forecast, perhaps, the committee might want to reserve, making a firm up or down. But, there is also a note here that raises the question about enacting a reserve for the childcare special fund. This is not a new, idea. The treasurer actually did a study on the state's reserves and stress testing practices and provided that report to the legislature in December. And we worked along with, finance and management on that report. And one of the recommendations is to consider putting a statutory reserve in here. Since the program is funded with payroll tax that could be volatile due to economic conditions, the thinking here would be a reserve would help ensure that the program always has resources to continue if there is volatility in the revenue without running into a deficit and sort of shifting those costs onto the general fund by default.
So Chris, what's the mechanism for doing that? I mean, where does this reserve money come from?
So there is.
Usually,
So the $8 million that was mentioned could be seed money to do that. And you could also, I mean, the legislature puts language in with like the general fund and the T fund and the ed fund about statutory reserves. Your colleagues in the appropriations committee could put similar language in that says like an amount not to exceed X% of either revenues or prior year appropriations or things of that nature. It's sort of a broader discussion about exactly what the words would look like.
thanks.
And I think just sort of on a process note, the question of whether or not they're spending at the speed they need to be spending is a question for the Human Services Committee and the Appropriations Committee. Pending the e-board next week, I think it's still not going to be clear whether or not the spending and the revenues are matching up, given that it is in the first year. So it's something that we will absolutely spend time on next year, as well as like sort of the numbers become clearer.
So are we gonna want guardrails on this special reserve as to what it can actually be used for?
That is certainly a broader discussion to be had. Like right now, the statutory reserves on like the stabilization reserves have some language around how they can be used, and there's sort of in layman's terms, to make sure you always end the fiscal year in the black. So you don't draw on the stabilization reserves just to pay for, some new thing. You keep it there. It's sort of like that couple $100 at the bottom of your checking account that you never spend, but it's there to make sure you never bounce a check. So I think it's an open discussion among the committees, the money committees, about what that would look like.
And I know everyone who was here last biennium really enjoyed that presentation we had about appropriate inflators. And I think we have a similar quality of presentation that might be available in the future for us on like how reserve funds, sort of best practices for reserve funds that we could maybe take on in the next few weeks. So this might be a great place to launch that work that JFO has done. Yeah, Representative Holcomb.
My question is just a where the money comes from question, which is this money was raised off the payroll tax. It is what it is. I'm uncomfortable with that. It's what we have. It creates some unique problems in areas, particularly border areas that are competing for labor. And to turn around and use it now for an unspecified purpose, which is what's happening here, is problematic, given that we've sold people that this is for supporting childcare. So I have a real issue with that, particularly because when we don't know where it's going, it's funding unbudgeted expenses. And I'm mindful of how we went after schools last year for their 100 million in increases around healthcare. We had the administration come in and talk about over $100 million in unfunded budget pressures related to healthcare in the state budget. And I just think we have an obligation, if we say this is for childcare, to use it for childcare.
So what's not clear, I think, and Chris, can you clarify? Because my understanding is that like, because this is a transition year, there was general fund money
Correct.
in that fund that was not,
Correct.
Can you clarify that a little bit?
Right there, and my colleague Pat has paid more attention to the details than I have, but yes, there was one-time general fund money put in to start the program. I don't read this as a recommendation that they're shifting payroll tax revenue to do anything else. If anything, they're reducing the general fund appropriations that went in to get the program started and then just shifting some of that cost over to the payroll tax.
Exactly, but then but my point is, then what is it being used for? What is $13 million being used for? When you're reducing pressure on the general fund in the totality of the BAA, how are we reallocating it?
Yeah.
I think we have to ask that question. I do think we have to ask that question.
And I think part of that question is a question for appropriations, sort of making sure that the special fund and the taxes for the special fund are set appropriately is sort of where we are here. I'm imagining, given that we need to come back to this in relationship to the e-board, we're not going to close this particular topic today. So does anyone else have anything else they want to put out for sort of outstanding questions on this agenda item? And we can.
It's not been answered already, but can we create a reserve fund even before we statutorily create a reserve fund?
I don't know what that means.
Like it says there that you could formally enact a reserve in the child care contribution special fund to ensure that the fund can fulfill its caseload obligations and protect itself against economic viability. Okay, so if we say if our recommendation is that we not allow this more money that was collected than what we're currently using to be used somewhere else, can we ask for that to be in a reserve fund before a reserve fund is statutorily set up?
Uh,
I think it's a surplus balance.
Right.
Fund statute.
Yeah.
Pardon me?
It's just a surplus balance in that fund until we create a special fund instead.
Okay, so you can do that. You can.
Functionally, and what I heard from CDB is that they actually already have that, even if this is approved and happens. Okay, any other outstanding questions?
Just,
Yeah, Representative.
Well, I was just gonna, regarding the 13 million, it would seem to me that if they are freeing up 13 million of general fund that had been there in the beginning to get things started, and now you're using the tax revenue that has come in to replace that, that 13 million is just gonna fall to the bottom of the general fund. And there are lots of other things within the BAA where they're using that for a variety of things.
I think that's the point I'm trying to make.
Right, but I guess I don't see a problem with that. It's, if it's falling to the bottom of the general fund. And yes, then in the big spreadsheet, there's lots of other things that are moving back and forth, and they come up with this total of 185 or whatever. That it's part of that. We just don't know specifically where that's going. It's just falling into the general.
Representative Kimball, and then, well, Zach, and then we're gonna move on to the next.
my question was, in terms of the actual total revenues going into the fund, is $92.8 million.
That was the forecast, I believe.
Forecast. Is that all from the payroll tax? It's 100% coming from the.
I'm looking to Pat to keep me honest, but that estimate should be from the payroll tax. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Because I wasn't sure, because they talked about other sources of funds coming into this particular fund. Federal, they're using those federal funds first, and then other funds, and then they'd be going into whatever.
We're speaking specific to the payroll tax revenues here.
Okay.
Yeah, just nothing new really, just saying that if we are just supplanting original general funds that we used to establish the fund, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I do need to know, and I heard you say that we're gonna find out from appropriations. Or we could find out from where that $13 million.
Mostly we leave it to appropriations because it's none of our business.
Okay.
Well,
Yes.
we know where some of it's going. It is going to offset the unbudgeted increases in healthcare costs.
Can I ask
Okay.
one quick question? I'm sorry, I know you
Yes.
said no more questions, which is how much came from the general fund to originally seed the program?
That's a great question.
Are we like over, returning money to the general fund, or did the general fund put in, $40 million and we're putting 13 million of that back?
I don't have that number with me.
Okay.
Let's go on to the next one.
All right, sections 40 and 41. You heard from Commissioner Gresham about this the other day. These two sections are thematically similar, where there was some increased demand for the adult diploma program. And my understanding is 60% of those costs are paid by the general fund in B504 and 40% paid from the ed fund in B504.1. So I did the math last night. These numbers do in fact break out to those 60-40 splits. And I just slugged in the word support here because I didn't hear any objections from the committee, but I'm certainly willing to change that if I totally misread your intent.
And the education committee is going to take testimony about all of the reversions and what's the opposite of reversion?
Carry forward.
Carry forward. For the education fund to really get into, are these programs being, used and managed towards intent? Yeah.
I followed this last year because, anyway, I did. And the reason that they need they're asking for the extra $500,000 is because the legislation they did last year said so many students times so much money is going to be appropriated from these two funds. And the calculation, they did not square off the calculation of the number of students until after the budget was passed. And therefore, the number of students times the X number of dollars is $500,000 more than what was in the budget for last year. So this is squaring up to support the students that are actually in the program.
Any other questions in this section for folks? Okay.
Next one, section 42 is, I believe Commissioner Gresham also spoke to this, is the adjusted education payment. There are two proposed appropriation reductions that would total $11 million to the education fund. The first is the $8 million reduction in the adjusted education payment to reflect the fact that voter approved education spending came in slightly lower than when the yield bill passed. The second one is to eliminate that duplicate appropriation for English language learners. Any questions? Cool.
Thanks.
Section 43 is on a similar theme, but about the appropriation for nutrition. The proposed reduction of $2.9 million of ed fund appropriations would more closely align the appropriation to demand for meal services.
And this, we will take more testimony on school meals and how school meals are funded, separate from budget adjustment, but just want to highlight that the amount this costs continues to go down.
When you schedule that testimony, it'd be good to get information on why, and also on participation in school meals programs.
So sections 50 and 51 deal with corrections to the property transfer tax allocations. This is a bit messy and tortured, but you all last session passed Act 180, which made some changes to the property tax.
Property transfer tax.
Property transfer tax.
I like to just call it the transfer tax.
The transfer tax, yeah.
The confusion that is consistent across the board on that.
Yeah. So there was language in both the big bill and in Act 181, which was that Act 250 housing reform legislation last year. You'll see that section 50 and 61 harmonized because section 61 would propose to delete the language from Act 181 and section 50 proposes to consolidate what Act 181 did into a revised budget language. I have a TBD here because our staff are just continuing to sharpen their pencils and double check the math and make sure that what is proposed conforms with what you all passed last year. So we just need a little bit more time to finalize that. Section 51, this is the really exciting stuff, the transfers to the general fund from other funds. Most people overlook these sections, but it's of interest to the committee because everything I flagged on this list deals with revenue that is going through other funds and would be available to support the general fund. So it's revenue into the general fund. The first one has to do with the Cannabis Regulation Fund. The administration proposed an upgrade of $3.4 million in the amount that would flow through the from the Cannabis Regulation Fund to the general fund. This would reflect the actual amount transferred. You all remember that 30% of this revenue, this is excise tax revenue, supports substance misuse prevention programming, and you will see in B313 an increase of that appropriation of 30% of this increase in revenue. So everything ties together. All right. Next one is sports wagering. You heard from Commissioner Knight on this topic. The administration proposes a reduction of about $860,000 to revise the estimated transfer from the sports wagering enterprise fund to the general fund. This would more accurately reflect revenue expectations. So the budget was based around a $7 million assumption, and it's expected to come in a little lower than that.
And at some point this session, not for BAA, I think it'll be important to take a little more testimony on this because from what I've heard so far, both usage and revenues are very different from what was discussed when we, when we passed it and the months following. And so I just want to make sure that we're all understand what's happening. But I don't, that's not necessary for the BAA. It's just, I think, part of our due diligence work.
So the next one is the reduction of $11.6 million in the transfer and the direct app from the Liquor Control Enterprise Fund to the general fund. This is a bit of a complicated topic, so I did TBD here. I'm not sure if the chair wants me to go through this now, but I can, or we could punt it, but.
Let's do like a super high level and let folks know
Sure.
that we're gonna go back into it.
Sure. So Commissioner Knight also spoke to this. This reduction is proposed to bring the Liquor Control Enterprise Fund back into balance. For many years, it appears that the enterprise fund had been running and carrying a deficit. Some of that is due to higher employee benefit costs and larger transfers from the fund to the general fund in recent years. A law was passed a few years ago in the context of a lot of broader liquor reforms that set a minimum amount of transfer from the Liquor Enterprise Fund to the general fund. And that was 20.4 million in FY23 and 21.2 million in FY24. These transfers, though, exceeded the amount of profit on the bottom line of the Liquor Control Enterprise Fund. So this proposed reduction would bring that fund back into balance. And I think this was raised among sort of the context of some concerns about accounting practices, and it's not great to carry an enterprise fund with a deficit.
And there's lots of funny legislative language from a few years ago when we made those changes to the to some liquor laws, and we want to make sure that we're sort of catching up in the line on that.
That just made me think of the Vermont Life Fund that was negative $2 million for a long time until we wiped that out.
In recent years, when there's been some money in the general fund, the legislature and the administration have been making a concerted effort to resolve special fund and enterprise fund deficits. Okay. Next one, Tobacco Litigation Settlement Fund. This recommended change would repeal a $3 million transfer to the general fund that was included in this year's budget. Had that $3 million transfer gone through, this settlement fund would have had a $1.6 million anticipated deficit at the end of FY26. Since there is revenue available in the budget, the administration is proposing eliminating this transfer since it's no longer needed, and that would avoid putting the fund into deficit.
There's no new revenues coming out of that fund, is it?
That's a complicated question. It's sort of periodic. It has to do with the tobacco litigation from the 90s. Nolan Langweil, my colleague, would be happy to come in and talk to you about that. I hope he's watching. The next few items deal with, there are some dormant special funds that have residual balances, and the administration is proposing transferring some of those residual balances over to the general fund and getting rid of the special funds, eliminating them. So one of those is the Workforce Education and Training Fund. And they are proposing that we sweep the $2.598 million and change balance that's left in that fund and moving it over to the general fund, since that fund is now obsolete, and the activities that it supported are now being funded through DOL's base appropriations.
Do you think it's a little weird that we're sort of cleaning up special funds and BAA rather than in the budget?
You know, I think it depends on the extent of the cleanup. If you've got, I think whether it's a technical correction is in the eyes of the beholder. I think if you have a fund that's been sitting there without an active use and there's a residual balance, that could be viewed as a technical correction. It's up to you all.
Yeah, and I mean, anytime we can clean up a special fund, I'm very happy to clean up the special fund, just sort of.
Yeah,
It
and
just seems like someone decided to a couple months ago and it's here, which is fine.
I think why is probably because there's some residual balances here that people have ideas on
Yeah,
how to
absolutely.
activate and use.
And I think the fact that it's BAA doesn't really matter. I mean, I'd rather use BAA money, I think, to clean those things up
Yeah.
and then look at the full budget.
Hmm.
A little less complicated, perhaps.
The next one is on a similar theme, but way less exciting. It's only $1,500 involved. The Traumatic Brain Injury Fund was funded with one transfer back in 2008. That transfer had been fully expended. The fund has just been accumulating compound interest since then, and the administration is proposing that this fund be repealed and the roughly $1,500 balance be swept into the general fund when the books close this fiscal year. All right. Next one is an upgrade to the direct app from the unclaimed property fund. The budget assumed that $6.5 million would be transferred from the unclaimed property fund to the general fund this year. Every year in the budget, there's a transfer or a direct app from the unclaimed property fund to the general fund. Ashlyn Doyon from the treasurer's office was here and spoke to this the other day. This $4.495 million increase is it represents the balance that remained at the close of fiscal 24 beyond the amount that was required in the previous budget to be transferred. So this change would just sweep what was on that bottom line over. And the last one on this section is the DFR special funds. There's a $3.374 million reduction in the expected direct app from a variety of financial regulatory special funds to the general fund. This is due primarily due to some diminishing applications and some rebasing of original estimates to their actual activity. The money that comes into these funds are things like the insurance producer fees, mutual fund fees, things of that nature. So this is a true up to ensure that sort of in a similar vein that we're not counting on more funds coming from those funds into the general fund than what we reasonably expect will be available. Okay. The next technical section is on reversions. You heard from Commissioner Bolio earlier this week on these. I listed the reversions that correspond to the tax department here. And these, as you heard from the commissioner, they represent appropriations authority that the department no longer needs for their originally intended purposes.
And I just want to name that the Department of Taxes estimated quite substantial cost to this new tax type when we passed the bill. And I am very glad that they were able to get it all done for so much less money. And I hope we all get to learn from it on how we estimate the costs of new tax types in the future.
Just one clarifying
Yeah.
question. The use tax reimbursement program, that is money paid to municipalities.
My understanding, yeah.
Okay, for current use, properties in current use.
My understanding. But yeah, these changes collectively return $7.1 million to the general fund to be available for future reappropriation.
Yeah, okay.
Similarly, there are reversions proposed from education fund appropriations. They total $24.258 million. What I penciled in here was, rather than taking a firm support or, oppose, that the committee, would defer, to the House Committee on Education, since these relate to appropriations, rather than revenues. But since the education fund is of interest to this committee, I flagged it on this list for your consideration.
I don't have any concerns with that, but I'm just wondering, since we made some substantial changes in adult ed and flexible pathways this year, if on the education, outlook, it makes sense to break those two out so that we can track them over time.
We can talk to Julia about it. When we start adding, we've added a lot of new rows lately, and when we add too many rows, it stops being the manageable, delightful thing it is. And I absolutely see where you're coming from. So I
And
just
that's
want to check in with her
exactly
about
why
it.
I want it broken
Yes,
out,
yeah.
because we're adding an awful lot of rows.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
On universal school meals, we talked about the 2.9 earlier. Where's the other 3-ish? Less than 3. Or am I misunderstanding?
6.
6.
Two.
Yeah, so we already talked about 2.9. That's costing less. Where's the rest of that money? What's the delta there?
I don't know what you mean.
Understanding your question.
What's that line, AOE?
These are prior appropriations
Right.
that are from prior years that are no longer needed. The first piece is an adjustment to the current year appropriation.
Okay. All right, I'll follow up.
So in 2024, that was $6.2 million was under budget for the universal school meals program.
Correct. And I don't know for sure if that was just 2004. Sometimes there could be.
Accumulated from,
I see.
You're looking at more than one budget.
Yeah.
all right.
All right, we're almost done. The next piece, section 53, is very technical language, but what this really does is, if you recall from Commissioner Gresham, there is a proposal to sort of notwithstand what we call the year-end construct to allow the sort of extra general fund money that we expect will be available at the end of the current fiscal year to be available to carry forward into FY26. So right now, the governor's recommendation calls for $87.2 million that would basically drop to the bottom line of the general fund and carry into 26. But in order to make that full amount available to carry forward into 26, you need to notwithstand this section of Title 32 that directs unallocated and unreserved balances to the rainy day fund and to the two pension funds. You will often see this language in the budget, and this is necessary in order to carry forward the full amount of whatever balance is left at the end of the year into 26 and get ahead of that year-end construct.
Thank you, Chris. I understand the construct and why it's necessary. I have difficulty sometimes following Commissioner Gresham and finding out what's being reverted, I guess we could say, and not spent, and it's not, maybe, I don't know, it's your responsibility to help us learn, but the issue is, where's the money not being spent? And is that really a good idea?
So that's a great question. This is the very question your colleagues in the Appropriations Committee are diving into. And this is basically the net result of all of the additional changes everywhere else in the budget or in the BAA as proposed.
Right.
Plus it factors in the revenue upgrade that we received in July. So when all of that sugars off, everything that they are proposing is projected right now to leave $87.2 million available to carry forward into next year.
Well,
So this BAA actually spends a fair bit of additional general fund because there are higher needs in certain areas. Employee health benefits are driving some of these costs. But there are also savings in some other areas and there's more money entering the mix.
so the explanation is eminently helpful, and I look forward to hearing what the appropriations committee has learned.
I would also direct on the JFO website, we post these documents
Okay.
and there's a one-page operating statement
Oh, yeah.
that the administration prepared and that will walk you through
Okay,
some of the changes
good.
numerically that they're proposing.
Thank you.
Have that on our website.
Great.
Representative Holcomb? I was just gonna say, last year, one of the things that particularly Tristan Tolino was tracking was vacancy savings and the relationship
Right.
between vacancy savings and covering healthcare increases. So there is a relationship there, and there's some data at JFO that speaks to that.
If I could continue just
Just a quick one, and then we're
on
gonna,
this specific on this theme. I've been concerned and some other people in the building now concerned about, for instance, DEC permits that are not being completed on a timely manner, and it appears that that's occurring because there isn't the staff to do them.
Mhm.
And so lack of staff means reversions of those monies to go forward. And I just bring that to the committee's attention. If you live in a community where stormwater permits, for example, are holding up substantial important projects, well, geez, maybe it's because there's not staff to get the permits done in a timely manner.
thanks, Jim.
Sometimes savings really has a cost.
said.
Good. That's good, Chris. Thank you very much.
We're almost finished here. There's two sections here about the telephone tax. I don't want to, pick a scab off a wound, but if you remember this very tortured bill from last year, H657, that made it over the finish line and accomplished some remarkable cleanup of very obscure, very tiny tax types. The bill as proposed, what the administration is proposing is bumping out the effective dates by 1 year. My understanding of that is because they need to hire some outside expertise to do some pretty complex tax valuation work involved with putting communications property on the grand list. And they need some more time. So this has a relatively minor impact to the two major funds. You'd see that and it would all happen next year in 26. It would mean that about 2 million more would be available in the general fund and about 3 million less available in the ed fund. But that's just for that 1 year until the tax changes take effect in the subsequent year.
Yes, we need to
Okay.
roll. So if it is a question about that,
It's not a question, it's,
Okay.
but it might remind people here that a number of years ago, there was a question of valuation of the Vermont portion of dams along the Connecticut River that we needed to hire expertise to figure out their value so that we could figure out who gets taxed for what.
Mhm.
So the concept is absolutely correct.
thank you. That was I still feel very proud of that incredibly nerdy bill. And I think the rest of the building was like, why? There must be something secretly interesting in here, but.
Real quick, and we're like literally almost done. Section 65 has to do with those technical changes about the overpayment of education taxes that Commissioner Bolio walked you through. There's no substantive change here. This language just makes sure that the intent you all enacted can actually be executed. Section, yeah, this is up in Canaan and those smaller towns in Essex County.
That don't have schools.
Yeah.
We directed it to towns and not to the district.
And I believe Craig went into this and summed up.
Yes.
And the last three sections, section 69, 70, and 79 repeal those, 69 and 79 repeal those dormant special funds we already talked about, whose balances are proposed to be swept into the ed fund. And section 70 is sort of a technical change that would, quite frankly, just adjust statute to the current practice of notwithstanding this annual transfer. So statute currently says there's to be an annual transfer and you often notwithstand it. The administration is proposing that you just do away with that statutory requirement you've been notwithstanding. And if you want to make a transfer, just make the transfer. So this isn't really overly substantive. It sort of aligns statute to current practice. That's it.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Right.
We're gonna give ourselves a mental stretch break while Chris gets up and walks away, and then we're gonna completely changed topics. Representative Higley, you
Good.
good? Okay. And so we will take a little bit more testimony on pieces that are directly related to this, and then there are pieces that are in here that will take more testimony about after budget adjustments, such as school meals. But we don't need to take a formal vote on any of this, but we'll straw poll sections. If you have concerns about sections of it that you have not raised today, please let me know sooner rather than later so we can make sure we get our work to the Appropriations Committee early next week. Thanks. And with that, low stretch, shifting into we're going to spend a lot of time this year on property valuation, how it works, how it doesn't work, different pieces of it, starting with the glorious common level of appraisal. And Jake Feldman from Tax is quite skilled at explaining it to people. I'm really glad that you were able to join us today, Jake. Thank you so much. I hope you're feeling better.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, feeling better. Can people hear me okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Yeah, so, excuse me. I'm Jake Feldman. I'm the Senior Fiscal Analyst at the Tax Department, and I work on education finance stuff quite a bit. So I think I'll be in there, a bunch over the next few months, including gathering the data for the commissioner's December 1st letter and working with JFO on property tax rates and all kinds of things. So yeah, I also work on all the other tax types too, but yeah, lots of time on education finance, especially recently. So I do have a PowerPoint, and I'm going to try, I think, to share my screen, unless is that the right way to do it, or should I?
Yes, that would be great. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. Oop, I had it for a second. Okay, can you guys see that red arrow with the buildings in it? All
You made
right.
a delightful picture for us.
Okay. So you're probably familiar with the CLA, or common level appraisal, from maybe time on a school board or just following the news. But it's an important part of our existing post Act 60 property tax system. So CLAs are general correction factors applied to every town's education property tax rates to make sure that the town is sending its fair share to the state's education fund. And the reason that I italicized the word town is because it's a town level factor, and it is not designed to override somebody's an individual's property value. It doesn't suggest that the state knows a property value better. But what it's doing is looking at, generally in a town, how values in the grand list, which might have been set years ago during a reappraisal, compare to what property is selling for recently in the town, actually over a window of the prior 3 years. So it's a town level general correction factor, and it's one number. There isn't a different CLA for for different categories of property. There isn't even a different CLA for homestead and non-homestead. Vermont's two property tax classifications. It's just one number. What Vermont does with CLAs is an example of indirect equalization, because we're applying them to the tax rates, not the property values themselves. There are places that do change property values in that way. They do direct equalization. But in those cases, it's a little bit different. Like, it's not a state thing, it's a local thing. And they have enough property under their jurisdiction that they can do a study and determine those factors property by property. But that's not what Vermont does. What we do is indirect equalization. And if anybody has a question, you guys are super tiny on my screen.
Don't worry, I'll interrupt you. I'm quite skilled at that at this point, Jake.
Okay. Thank you. They come from PVR's annual equalization study done in the fall each year. And the equalization study compares the grand list values to the sale prices over the prior 3 years. And a town where properties are generally selling for less than they're listed for in the grand list will have a CLA over 100%. And a town where properties are selling for more than they're listed for, which is the case in most places right now, will have a CLA that's less than 100%. I showed this pretty wonky chart a couple years ago in Ways and Means, and it got picked up by the media, which I thought was very exciting and strange, but I thought it's sort of a nerdy representation of what happened during COVID and how that's playing out with CLAs. So CLAs are a comparison of listed value to what property is selling for. And if it's selling for a lot, property selling for a lot more than it's listed for, then that listed divided by sale price is going to result in a lower fraction or a lower percentage. So in leading up to COVID, Vermont's real estate market was just kind of humming along at a normal-ish looking, 95%. So property was generally listed for about 95% of what it was selling for. But then starting with COVID, things really took a different path. The market heated up quite a bit, and property was selling for much more than it was listed for in the grand list. And my chart runs out, it's a little bit old, I said, it runs out in February 22nd, in February 2022. But that trend has basically continued over the next couple years. So it's been a very hot real estate market recently. Over the past 5 years, the CLAs that coming out of the equalization study have really shifted quite a bit. In the 2020 study, so that was done at the end of 2020, and it looked at sales basically right up to COVID, like end of March 2020. The study results from that study that played into FY 2022 tax rates were very normal looking. We had 176 towns that had a CLA between 85 and 100%, just a handful that had a very low CLA. And then 79 that were just on the other side of 100, which is also pretty normal. And then we didn't have any that were very high. So that was our last normal year. And then the subsequent studies were gradually pulling in more and more of that COVID period. So the study that PVR did at the end of equalization, at the end of 2021, included sales up to March 31st of 2021. And so you're starting to get a year of COVID effect there. And you can see kind of a little bit of a shift towards lower CLAs. 203 that were between 85 and 100, and 24 that were less than 85%. Since then, it's just kept on shifting in that direction. And in recent years, last year we had 209 towns out of the 260 or so that had a CLA that was less than 85%. So that's incredibly low. And that is when there used to be a trigger in law that if your CLA was under 85%, you had to reappraise, but there were just so many that was suspended. And then again, this year, similar to last year, really heavily towards the under 85%. When towns reappraise, we're actually going to talk about what happens in a reappraisal in a couple slides, but that it supersedes the equalization study, and there's a different calculation.
Oh, I love this slide. I was just saying, I love this slide, Jake.
Thank you. Yeah, so there's been a little bit of misunderstanding, and it's totally understandable that people would have this misunderstanding, because like if in the times before COVID, when everybody's CLA is just kind of like pretty stable, and if you were on the school board or something like that, you were watching out for the letter from PVR in December because you didn't want your own CLA to go down because you thought you were going to get a ding on your tax rate. And so you develop this mentality that CLAs dropping are the reason that tax rates go up. Because if you look at it from the micro perspective of your own town, it can certainly feel that way. But what's happening with COVID, where everybody's CLA is going down, it really, it changes the landscape. And we definitely, tax and JFO, incorporate CLAs into our modeling. So it's not a situation where we figure out these education tax rates and then CLAs are just applied kind of at the end, and we're not aware of them, and it's some big mistake. And if you could just stop CLAs from going down, that would fix everything. That's not the truth. It's not anywhere near the truth. Tax and JFO always incorporate the eventual CLAs, which we know what they will be, and in our modeling. And this is because one of the primary inputs to the yield model, which is that thing that Julia and I maintain for balancing the ed fund, is what is known as the equalized education grand list, which is the fair market property value of each town and post CLA. And I think as in your committee, you've been talking about general tax principles and a bigger base. And the state's base for property taxes is the equalized education grand list. That means lower rates, kind of all else held equal, right? You have more to tax, so you can lower rates. And it's kind of easy to see that is true with the statewide non-homestead rate, and which from FY21 to FY25 did go down a bit. Like with FY22 to FY23, it dropped, and FY23 to FY24, it dropped, and then FY25, it looks like it stayed steady, and it did because FY25, there's a lot of spending pressure, but it would have dropped if that wasn't the case. And that is an equalized rate, so it's before CLA. So it is dropping, and then, but once CLAs are applied, actual non-homestead rate, it has been, you know, more steady or even increasing. It lower CLAs, and on homesteads, it's a little bit harder to see how it flows through, but the yield number, which everyone is on the lookout for, that incorporates a lot of things, but one of the main things is the equalized education grand list. So the homestead yield went up a little bit in FY22, but then it really went up quite a bit in FY23 by almost 2,000. And that's because of CLAs dropping. And during that period, you know, we didn't hear like districts complaining like, oh, my CLA is going down. Because on the front end, on the yield was going up. And then FY24, it went up even more than 2,000. FY25, it might have gone up, or it might have even stayed the same, but I have that big red star there because in FY25, not only was there quite an increase in education spending, which put downward pressure on the yield, but there was a rebasing of student counts. So that mathematically required a pretty massive correction downward to the yield because there are a lot more students with a new weighting system. So
Can you go back for a second?
Yeah, sure. Let me figure out how.
You succeeded.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Was there a question?
Nope. No, you're good. Keep on going. Sorry.
Okay. And I think I sent Sorcha this as a PDF too, so it might be it's posted under my name as well. Okay, so let's take a look at how the CLA is applied, and we're going to look at the town of Linden for the current property tax year, FY25.
Representative Feltus feels very honored. Thank you. Thank you, Jake.
You can now explain.
So for homesteads, you start with per pupil spending and divide that by this property yield that everybody's always looking out for, and that creates an equalized tax rate, or what shows up on your bill as a school district tax rate. And we actually finally, for the first time we've been trying for a while, but we finally in FY25 got that the whole CLA calculation on the front of the tax bill. So when you're next at home, which maybe is later today, take a look at your property tax bill, and you're going to see this on the very front of it, which is great. So the per weighted pupil spending for Kingdom East, which Linden is fully a part of, that school district, was 12,878. And the yield in FY25 was 98.93. So you take the per pupil spending, divide by the yield, and you get this equalized rate pre-CLA. You take that tax rate and divide by the CLA to get the actual tax rate. So Linden CLA is 75.91%, which means that in the town of Linden, all property is generally listed for 75.91% of its true fair market value. So 1.3017 divided by that CLA gives you 1.7148, which is the actual homestead rate that taxpayers see on their bill. And then the non-homestead rate in Linden and everywhere is you just take the uniform statewide non-homestead rate and divide it by whatever the town's CLA is. So you take the 1.391 was the uniform non-homestead tax rate this year, and divide that by 75.91 to get 1.8324. Okay, reappraisal years are a little bit tricky, but the important thing to know is that CLAs smooth them out. It feels like, you know, oh gosh, my town is reappraising, property value, you know, is probably going to go way up. But the CLAs actually work to make that transition a lot smoother. And towns do not win or lose with respect to how much they pay into the education fund. That doesn't happen in a reappraisal. We do have to calculate the CLA in a reappraisal year differently. What we do is we take the new total listed value after the reappraisal and we divide it from the most recent estimate of fair market value from the last equalization study. Burlington did a reappraisal in FY22 after 15 or 16 years of not reappraising. And there were a lot of issues, a lot of questions. But you know, the CLA it did what it was supposed to do in that case. Not to say that things worked out perfectly for everybody, which they didn't. But I can explain how the rate transition worked. So prior to their reappraisal, their CLA was quite low, and as a result, the actual homestead rate was quite high. It was $2, more than $2 per $100 of property value. But right after the reappraisal, that CLA shot up, which it's supposed to do, and the actual homestead tax rate went way down. And those two things worked with the change in property value. Listed property values went up a lot, but the actual tax rates went down 42%. And property tax credits are based on prior year taxes. And if the property value went up by about 42%, which is how much the rates went down, then the credit was consistent. The trouble is that in a reappraisal, some people's property values can go up or down much different than the town average. And in those situations is where you can get tax impacts. Even though maybe the average in Burlington was like 40% increase or something, there were cases where individual property owners may have doubled in value or something along those lines. And that is where you can see tax impacts. And that's also where you can see the credit not being consistent because it's based on the prior year stuff. And if you have a big change in value like that, then the credit, from the prior year is not going to be aligned. So that did happen in Burlington. And it does happen with every reappraisal everywhere. But the problem is not the CLA in that case. That the problem is just the fact that happens in a reappraisal, and the longer you go without reappraising, the more of those variances you're going to get.
I'm so sorry. I'm sorry that anyway, continue on. We all just had a moment of feeling bad for you and I wanted to express that, but it's very hard to do via Zoom and I'm glad you're at home. So continue on. I hope you have a good weekend.
Thanks. PVR's 2024 equalization study produces the CLAs that are gonna affect FY26. So the coming property tax year, they're posted for you to take a look at that link. And then Julia, Julia's gonna have some really helpful stuff about a change made last year that kind of, I should have mentioned it a few slides ago, but I was talking about how, you know, the non-homestead rate drops and the yield goes up when the CLAs go down, and this change made last year that Julia's going to talk about actually kind of takes the market changes out of the yield and the non-homestead rate. We also have these FY25 education tax rates for all the towns in the state and a colorful map, and a lot of frequently asked questions about education taxes at that second link that tries to cover, you know, the core things that people ask us about. So please have a look when you're able to.
Thanks. And I think you're coming in next week to talk a little bit more about some of the reports you submitted to us. So thank you.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks. Do you have
I have a question.
Okay, Representative Holcomb.
First of all, thank you for your clarity. I really appreciate your work. It's very, very helpful. But I wanted to ask a question because I come from a town or several towns that have more than doubled their property values in just a couple of years. And what we're starting to see is some signs that the different treatment of homestead and non-homestead bases may actually be eroding the tax base. And I just didn't know if there's any way, or has the state ever looked at differential changes in values in homestead and non-homestead by town to see if there's an impact? And by that specifically, it is so much, the carrying cost of a non-homestead property is so much lower now compared to a homestead in two of our towns that we are starting to see when people sell, the houses are being bought by second home owners who then pay a property tax rate that is substantially lower. And so I don't know if you are beginning or have ever looked at whether because the pressures, I mean, some of the purchasing wasn't uniformly distributed around the state. It seems to be intensely concentrated in some regions. Or maybe that's not true. I don't know. But are you seeing any evidence that the large gaps in tax rates between non-homestead and homestead in some communities are leading to differential impacts on values of properties in those regions?
Holcomb, do you mind if Jake thinks on the answer to that question?
I don't expect that now. I certainly
Okay.
don't expect that now. I'm just throwing it out there.
Jake, do you mind thinking on that question and then coming back and answering it another time? Because it's a big one. Thank you. Because it's a really interesting piece of this, all the valuation puzzle and the homestead, non-homestead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Situation.
happy to ponder it. Sure.
Thank you very much. Any other questions for Jake? And then Julia's gonna go a little bit deeper on the work that we just did last year on this. Okay, thank you very much. We'll see you after lunch.
Great. Thank you very much.
Would you like to join us? Sure. Thanks.
I guess, yeah.
Yeah. The little table doesn't need to be there. You can fix that another time. Hi, welcome.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you all too. For the record, I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office.
Would you like your screen and do the 5 on in?
All right, I will. So there is a slide deck posted on the committee page under my name. It's the same one that I'm showing here. Okay, so, sorry?
Success.
Great. So following up with Jake just did a walkthrough of the CLA. And I'm here to talk a little bit in more detail about a change to the way that the CLA is worked through in education finance. This was a change that was included in last year's yield bill. And the technical term we'll be talking about is the statewide adjustment to the CLA, but we'll be talking about what that means. I also want to just give a little bit of a heads up. There's a lot of formulas in the presentation. We'll also talk through in words, but for those of us who do better to see how things play out in a formula, I've included some examples with some exemplary numbers. But essentially overview, what is the statewide adjustment to the CLA? As I said, it was included in last year's yield bill. And essentially what it does is it's a mathematical exercise that we, being JFO and tax, do in the background to more closely align the pre-CLA rates, so those equalized rates that Jake was talking about, with the post-CLA property tax rates that folks see on their property tax bills. And the way this is done is it's by comparing local CLAs to the statewide average CLA, which is around 70% this year. I want to note right up front what we'll follow back in the end about how this actually works, but it doesn't impact the actual property tax rates, meaning that this statewide adjustment, after all of the math is said and done, is not impacting the tax rate that folks are seeing on their bills. It's just more closely aligning those pre and post CLAs. And so there's some math functions that we need to do in order to make sure that there is no impact, right? Big note up front that I will say out loud, that all of the numbers and the figures in the presentation are only for example purposes. They don't reflect current data. They're not talking about a specific school district. They're not even talking about a specific town. I just chose really round numbers to keep things simple. So, excuse me. So before going into what the statewide adjustment does, I thought it'd be helpful to review the way that the property tax calculation worked before the statewide adjustment. These slides will look familiar to those of you who were in the committee last year. These were a lot of these slides were used during the deliberation of the statewide adjustment. But you'll recall that the way that a local property tax rate is calculated is you take the district's per weighted pupil spending, you divide it by the yield, and that gives us that pre-CLA rate. We then take the pre-CLA rate and we divide it by the local CLA to get the tax rate that's showing up on somebody's tax bill. So these are the assumptions. You see that they're really round. We're going to assume that there's a statewide yield of 10,000 because it's round, a statewide average CLA of 0.75, and then we're going to pretend there's this District A that has a per pupil spending of 15,000 and a local CLA of 0.6. So where do we put those numbers into this calculation? So we plug in the district's per pupil spending of 15,000. We plug in the yield of 10,000. So we can see that this pre-CLA rate, this equalized rate, is 1.5, 150. But because the district is not appraised at 100% of fair market value, we need to ensure that they're paying their fair share into the education fund. So because this District A has a CLA of 60%, we need to apply that 60% CLA, that 0.6 CLA, to their equalized rate to get the actual tax rate showing up on bills. So that's where we go from the 150, divide by the 60% CLA, 0.6, and that gives us the actual tax rate folks are seeing of 250. So that was what was happening with the CLA up until last year. And then last year, there was the conversation of, well, how can we get these pre-CLA rates closer to the post-CLA rates, right? $1.50 to $2.50, that's a pretty significant increase from a pre-CLA rate to post-CLA rate. So the policy choice that was made and then was passed in the yield bill was the statewide adjustment. So essentially, we're going to just quickly walk through what that means. So this is the formula that we were just looking at, right? The actual rate is the per pupil spending divided by the yield. We've got our pre-CLA rate, we divide by the local CLA. To make it neutral, we need to do a lot of background math. And one of those things that we do is we multiply the yield by the statewide average CLA. And we divide the local CLA by the statewide average CLA. You'll remember back into algebra, those things are canceling each other out, right? Okay, so this is what we just walked. I am sorry, I'm realizing now that this title is not reflective of what this slide is showing. So I will follow up. I promise the numbers work. The title does not. So I'll follow up with that, but what we're seeing here is we're still doing the same thing, right? So now we're applying the statewide adjustment, but we're doing it in a couple of steps. So first, we still have the same district per pupil spending of 15,000. But now we're including in that 0.75, that statewide adjustment CLA. So we're multiplying the yield by the statewide adjustment CLA, right? We're putting it in two places. So that's giving us a pre-CLA rate of $2 instead of the $1.50 that we were looking at earlier. Then we still need to get to that actual tax rate of $2.50. We're not changing that actual tax rate. So what we're also doing is we're adjusting that local CLA by the statewide average as well. Which is where we see here, we're plugging in that the district's local CLA divided by the statewide average. So essentially, instead of bringing everybody up to 100% for the purpose of the tax rates, we're bringing everybody to the statewide average. So we're bringing some people down or some towns down, we're bringing some towns up. And so we can see here that we're still getting to that tax rate of $2.50. So this is all of those numbers that we just looked at comparing against each other. So what we can see is that the statewide adjustment, the statewide average CLA, what we're doing is we're really aligning those pre-CLA property tax rates more closely to the post-CLA property tax rates. We also see that the post-CLA tax rate is the same in both cases. So we've got this same district per pupil spending. Really, these changes are being picked up in the yield, and they're being picked up in the pre-CLA tax rate, as well as the CLA that's showing up on the bill, but the actual rate is the same. So I know that was quick. That was all I had prepared. I'm happy to answer any questions if that's helpful.
So really, what you're saying is it's more of an optics thing, again, because you can't use a state CLA that's 100% and you don't really know what that 100% is, right? So you're coming up with a new statewide CLA, adjusting every town CLA. But like you said, there's no change in that amount that's calculated for each town, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
that's correct. It really, the way, like, going a little bit weedier into the details of how we're doing it is the tax department is still doing the equalization study. And then what happens is we have the average, we take all of the CLAs across all of the towns, we calculate what the average CLA is per that equalization study, and that's what we're putting in here. So it really, all it is just, instead of bringing every town up to 100%, we're bringing every town up to the average so that there's not such large swings, but once you apply the CLA.
Thank you.
But it doesn't matter.
Right.
It's still the same dollar amount.
That's correct. Well, I will say, I'm not saying that it doesn't matter is correct. That's not my place to say. I will say that it doesn't matter from a math perspective if we are looking at the actual tax rate that's showing up on tax bills.
Representative Feltes?
That was my question the other day. What was the purpose in doing that? Is to just have not as great a swing that people would see and they say, oh my God, my bill is the same. You're absolutely right. It's $2.65, but the CLA, it just doesn't make it seem as you're so far out of whack. But we know we're out of whack, so what difference does it make? But anyway, I guess.
Soon you will start, maybe you have already started receiving a lot of emails, not specific to property valuation and property taxes, I'm not sure, but a significant number of them involve blaming the CLA for everything.
I understand that.
And the idea was to really just sort of narrow that gap because was significantly confusing to people to have that big gap between their district tax rate and their town tax rate. And so it was to try to close that a little bit so that folks weren't hearing both. I think it's very confusing because folks hear about their district tax rate at their school board meetings and that's what's talked about. And then the town tax rate comes in so wildly different. And so it was a way to close that gap.
Well, and particularly, I think in like a district of mine that has, 7 different towns.
Yeah.
And every CLA in every town is different. And so one goes way up and one goes down and wait a minute.
Yeah, it was a calm the waters algebra problem.
To start with, what I think Representative Kimball said, is an optics thing in many respects, is it, the CLA was driving people crazy.
Mhm.
And this is an attempt to calm the waters, to use math to, well, by bringing things closer to an average or using an average is so that in your town, when you open your tax bill, look at the CLA and what effect it's had, people are less inclined to say, oh my God, and blame everything on the CLA so that we can begin to move forward with a more rational discussion, I guess I'd say.
Yeah, I just said, so just to clarify though, I had a conversation with someone from the Ed Committee who said that, CLA isn't really impacting your final tax bill. It still is though. So if you still have a drastic shift in your town CLA from one year to the next, which has been happening in my town, you're still gonna see an impact from that CLA being applied. A pretty big one, yeah?
What's that? Julia's gonna answer that.
I guess it depends on which perspective that you're coming at it from. The way that I think is helpful to think about it is what the CLA is really doing, it's adjusting for a growth in the base that is not reflected in the grand list because the town has not reappraised. So the idea being, we've got this statewide education fund that everybody's paying into. But if we're measuring property values in one way in one town, and we haven't measured property values in the same way in different towns recently, then it means that across the state, you've got some towns that their values are not what they really are on the grand list, and other towns that maybe have property values on the grand list that are higher than what they are actually would be appraised at. And so what the CLA is doing is it's really a mathematical exercise of ensuring that everyone is paying their fair share into the education fund, regardless of when they were last appraised.
No, I totally understand what the purpose of CLA is and what it's trying to do, but I'm just saying, when you're calculating your individual tax rate and you start, at the top with spending and, divide it by yield and divide it by the CLA. If that CLA really does change a lot from one year to the next, you're still going to see a swing. If everything else was held constant, which obviously it's not, but if you were to hold everything else constant, you would still see an increase in your individual tax bill because your CLA dropped.
Well, I think the point is that it's not everything else is ever held constant. And so what you see on one end in the CLA, the tax department and JFO are using on the other end to actually calculate the tax rate. And so it could be the lowered tax rate that you'll see on one end because the base has grown.
Right.
And then the CLA is accommodating that. And so it's because nothing else is ever held equal.
Okay.
So, we have to end in 3 minutes, and this is a conversation we're going to keep on having. So Julia, do you want to jump in and?
Yeah, I was just gonna follow up, like from the modeling perspective side of things. Often, especially last year, we were receiving the question of, what if we held CLAs constant to the prior year? Or what if we put a cap on how much CLAs could swing from one year to the next? The answer is because we have the correct CLAs all included in the yield model and for the calculation of tax rates, if there were to be that policy choice to artificially change CLAs, then the ed fund would be short in how we have modeled it. So then we would need to up the rate that the tax rate that the CLA is being applied against in order to have the ed fund not falling into a deficit.
The reality is if your property value increases, your taxes go up.
Well, no, your rate should go down.
Go
Your
down.
taxes should stay the same.
Theoretically, but the CLA is going to adjust to reflect your property value.
I think we actually need to spend more time on this algebra as a committee, and I think it's not gonna happen today. And so we're gonna pick CLA up maybe after lunch as part of our other testimony and maybe next week depending. So thank you, everyone. And I'll see you at 1:00.
You're also
15.
doing a presentation on the.
Not planning on it.
Most realistic situation.